I've been working on this book for a long time, maybe 8 years in total. It started off as my dissertation at Berkeley, but at key points in time over the last 4 years while I've been working for Scott, I needed time to sort of to work on the book, and we still had all the deadlines and all the things that we normally have to get done. And Scott was so gracious to sort of give me the latitude to work on that I really couldn't have finished the book without his help. So I wanted to thank him publicly for that. And I want to thank Scott thanked the board, but I really want to thank John Moon and Shalise Fryer who helped organize the nuts and bolts of this event, and I really do appreciate that. I also want to thank the Urban Institute Press for taking a chance on me. I was the first writer out of the box, and so that was very exciting for them to sort of think that this was worthy of such an important press house. And lastly, I'd like to thank my husband, Doug, who's here, and I'm happy that he's here for a couple of reasons. One, I can thank him publicly, but two, he's been helping me with this project over the last 8 years, and consistently has done a better job describing it to people. So if I don't do a good job explaining it to you, well, I'll direct your questions to him after the end. So what I'd like to do is just sort of give you sort of an overview of the book. Tell you a little bit why I think it's important and how it fits into, I think, a larger story. But basically, the book just focuses on, and can you hear me all right? Is this, okay. 3 policy periods that I really focus on are the 1960s, what I call the rise and fall of the bureaucracies and affordable housing and urban development. A period that follows that's a sort of this period of real federal, I guess you'd call it federal inaction, that is a kind of there's a sort of surprising aspect to that second period because you had an explosion, a sort of revolution from below of local groups sort of taking matters into their own hands and doing things to build affordable housing and try to revitalize certain areas of their communities. And then sort of end with a third period where you see a combining of those local efforts with federal funding mechanisms that sort of build those local efforts up to scale. And so that's really sort of the arc of the book. I talk a little about some case studies. I'll go over a couple of those towards the end of the presentation. And then I have some policy recommendations at the very end. But one of the other things that motivated me to write this book, and it's part because this came out of the work I had done at Berkeley in the history department there, which is if you went to a library and you pulled off a book off the library shelf and on U.S. history, a textbook there, and said, okay, I want to see what's the sort of history of welfare state history in the 20th century in the United States, or the history of programs for low-income people in the 20th century. What you would read is that in the 1930s there was an explosion on the scene with the New Deal. Another explosion on the scene in the 1960s with the Great Society and the War on Poverty that is followed by a political backlash that puts that effort on the defensive, that was accompanied by a rise in conservative ideology and a rollback of the welfare state. If you were to sort of if you were to pull out a companion volume there just on affordable housing history, what you'd read is that we would follow that arc pretty closely. You'd see public housing kind of coming on the scene in the 1930s. In the 1960s, you get new programs like the 221d3 program or the Section 8 program, the creation of HUD in 1965, followed again by this period of inaction where the federal government sort of retreats. And I guess my response to that, and this is something, I'll only read this 2 sentences from the book. That would someone was teasing me that I would do some kind of Finnegan's Wake reading of the whole thing. But the problem with that story is that you might have trouble hearing it over the din of construction of more than 2 million federally subsidized apartments for low-income tenants built between 1986 and 2006. These units were built by for-profit and non-profit housing developers and funded largely with tax credits and federal block grants. And this is a story that I feel is just not that well understood. And that's part of why I wanted to get this story out into the debate. The other piece, and I think this is important too, as we think about the policies going forward, is to put this project into sort of its longer term sort of perspective. And so I think in order to do that, I think you really need to go back about 10,000 years. And what you do is if you have when people first start living in communities, stable communities, there's really only 2 ways to organize your society. You either do it through raw power or you do it through tradition. And in this example, the pharaoh's kind of running the show, okay? And so, in control of the politics, the economics, and all the rest. And so, he's going to pick you to be a baker, and if you're not down with that, you get your hands cut off, right? And it works. That's a system that works. But you also have, here's Marc Chagall giving some insights about traditional life in a village, and here it works a little differently, not nearly as rough, but you have these roles, these traditional roles and responsibilities kind of handed down from generation to generation. You make sure there's a baker in each generation because you pass these things on from father to son. That's how you run traditional societies. And what I was sort of exploring with this book was, in the modern era, you have things starting to change pretty dramatically. And we think about the early modern period dating back to about 500 years. And there you get, it's just follow through with the economic example, you have a situation where the market economy is not, the economy is not run by fiat or by tradition, but by the market. You have a whole new approach to politics. So you have the social contract theorists emerge. You have people exploring democracy and different issues around that. And another development that you may not think of as a sort of a crowning human achievement is, and particularly if you've been to the DMV lately, is the advent of bureaucracy. And sort of one of our leading lights of trying to understand bureaucracy is Max Weber. I know I've been working on this project for a long time when he looks very young to me. So I don't know, so it's like, I don't know. But Weber really is opening our eyes to sort of what's sort of dramatic and sort of revolutionary about bureaucracies, in that they are sort of rational organizations. They have rules. They're written down. You can read them. Anybody can apply to be. If you pass an aptitude test, you can advance within the organization based on certain sort of rational principles. In fact, the whole entity sort of takes reason and tries to apply that to the issues that it was set up to deal with. And it's a dramatic event, a development in human history. Now, this has a kind of a parallel if you think about the built environment. And you have, again, sort of cities, you have power cities and you have tradition cities, and maybe you think about this sort of, it's always fun to go through, like, wander your way through some of these quaint little medieval villages and things like that. But really, when people are living in those places, like, well, sanitation's not that great, it's congested, it's sort of, there's no air flowing through here. And so you get some modern thinkers like Corbusier saying, look, we can apply reason to the cities, to the built environment as well. And so we all know what a dump Paris is, and Corbusier decided, well, he's going to take a look at that and see if he can't fix it. And so here's Corbusier's a plan for Paris in the 1920s. Here you have the Ile Saint-Louis and the Seine, and here's the Latin Quarter. And the idea was to sort of bulldoze all those crummy old ratty neighborhoods and build something that would be much better, right? Here you have these sort of what you call towers in the park, right? And there's all kinds of light and air, and there's sort of, these are really healthy places to live, and there's recreation all around here. You solve the congestion problem because he's built up. And there's all kinds of sort of dramatic improvements in terms of transportation. And this is reason applied to the city to make the life more livable. Now, Weber and Corbusier are haunting the halls of American affordable housing policy in the 1960s, because you can see some of what's going on here, right? This is the Pruitt-Igoe homes in St. Louis, Missouri. These were actually built a little before the 60s. This is a little bit out of the sequence, but if you can kind of bear with me for a second. Again, you can see the modernist principles here. Towers in the park, right? Plenty of recreational space. Here's a school, here's a church, here's a bus, public transportation, plenty of parking, very nice. And what you see in the 1960s is this sort of sense that we can apply reason to the problems and fix it. In fact, when you look at the reports, you look at the affordable housing reports, the HUD reports of the mid and late 60s, what really strikes you is this confidence. People just feel like, look, we're just going to figure it out. We'll sort of get some engineers on that, figure out what the problem is, boom, we'll come up with a program to fix it. Another thing that's remarkable about the 60s is that there's this soaring rhetoric. So you have this really interesting, Lyndon Johnson sort of has this great line where he says, America has conquered space, brought abundance to the marketplace, and is going to solve the problems of the slum, right? Bam, bam, bam. And what's really cool is that sort of, these weren't empty words. There was real money put towards these goals and objectives. And so what you get in the late 1960s is a dramatic increase in the HUD budget. And you see the number of housing apartments built by HUD increased dramatically, 8 to 9-fold. There's a burst of activity between 1969 and 1973 where HUD starts building almost 500,000 apartments a year, a dramatic increase over the earlier periods. And many of those homes are decent, nice homes for low-income families, but a lot of them were instant slums. And a lot of them start going bad. This is Pruitt-Igoe about 10 years later. And you can see where some of the problems start to generate. Maybe you're managing Pruitt-Igoe and you're saying, okay, well, something's wrong here. I mean, something's wrong with maybe the design's wrong. There's too much indefensible space, as the argument went at one point. There's no eyes on the street, as Jane Jacobs said, or perhaps there are problems with the way it's being managed, or something like that. Well, you contact your regional supervisor in St. Louis, who contacts the committee, who sends the note to the management committee in Washington D.C., and then maybe it gets up to the secretary. By the time that decision gets made and it comes back down that bureaucracy, this could have been going on for years. So this is a real problem. And you also have, HUD at this time is also making some really big mistakes in terms of resource allocation. So it's not uncommon to have HUD building 10,000 units of apartments in a part of the city that's been abandoned by 10,000 families that left 10,000 inhabitable apartments there. So there's all these, the bureaucracy is just moving too slow. It's not anticipating the problems. It's not correcting fast enough. And I often think of it as just trying to hunt a mouse in your kitchen with an elephant gun. By the time you sort of level the barrel and pull the trigger, you're blowing holes in the wall, but that mouse just keeps on, scurrying away. So the bureaucracies aren't working. Now, to be fair, bureaucracies aren't working in a lot of other places as well, including the building we're sitting in. Then in the 1970s, there's a period of stagflation. All the brilliant economists in this building can't figure it out and fix it either. And the brilliant sort of bureaucrats who run the U.S. military can't figure out how to win the Vietnam War. And Watergate has put a pall over the executive branch and the presidency as well. So there are a lot of institutions that are on the run during this time. So I know there's some people from HUD here, so I don't want to think I'm just picking on you. But what happens is that increasingly it's clear that these programs aren't working, which and I think it's one of the. This really struck me. I read this line. Christopher Jenks writes this line in the language of postmodern architecture. He says, modernism ended at 3:32 p.m. on July 15th, 1972. That's the moment when the Pruitt-Igoe was demolished. And this is really a pivot point, I think, and this is the point I'm trying to make in the book. What in the book is that not only were these modernist structures dynamited at that time, but the institutions that built them were also dynamited. A year later, there's a moratorium. HUD is no longer building housing units as it had before in those big numbers. HUD has one more burst of building in the late 1970s, but by and large, it's out of the housing and urban development business by the early 70s. So the question, what are you going to do after if it's not clear what the next step is? You've got sort of conservatives on your right who are just saying, look, everything the government touches is terrible. You have liberals on the left who don't know exactly what to do next, and so it creates a pretty significant problem. And what I'm arguing in the book is that what happens is the federal government retreats. Local people don't accept that retreat. They step into the breach and say, look, we're going to do something about these communities. We're going to make them better. If it means a spaghetti dinner fundraiser and a raffle and we slap a coat of paint on that duplex and put some families into this neighborhood, that's what we're going to do. But it gets a lot more sophisticated than that. And there's some developments that I think, a lot of the people in this room are really familiar with. So you have someone like Dorothy Mae Richardson in Pittsburgh who basically organizes her neighborhood to say, look, we're going to try to turn this place around. And she does that for other neighborhoods. She grows that organization that becomes NeighborWorks. I mean, a powerful institution we have in our country today. And the list goes on. You could talk about Pat Clancy in the community builders in Boston, Don Turner building bridge housing in San Francisco. All of these people are starting to do something in their communities without federal help. And what I argue in the book is that when we get to a third period, I don't want to mix my eras with my periods here. We get to a third period of housing policy, where you get our federal policymakers are stepping back and saying, wait a minute, something's working here at the local level. We're not sure exactly what it is, but if we could give them more resources, maybe they could grow it to a larger scale. And that, by about 1986, you used to get the low-income housing tax credit, the home investment partnership block grant program in 1990. You start seeing more resources from the community development block grant program that predates these programs, moving towards housing. But you start seeing that to be this sort of the mechanism by which the federal government starts to create this quasi-market for affordable housing that is being met by these local groups. So what I'm arguing is that the sort of bureaucracy here, this sort of rational command control sort of organization, gets replaced by something that's more accurately thought of as a network. And the network's interesting because what it does is it allows you to leverage sort of resources, ideas, subsidy, global capital in a way that can get it into all the nooks and crannies of the network. So, for example, you might have affordable housing developers out here. Maybe they go through their housing finance agency in their state to get some tax credits. They might get some help with some type of intermediaries like Liskin Enterprise to help them sort of structure their deals. And they're plugging into a bigger sort of connection, a bigger collection of resources in terms of money, subsidy, capital, ideas, best practices. And what happens is these innovations get moved through the system really effectively. And that's basically the system we have today. What you have is local groups. They're often nonprofit community development corporations, but there's sometimes for-profit firms as well. You have local government redevelopment agencies. You have counties. States play a role. Local banks, local community foundations, large foundations. You have a number of different institutions that play these intermediary roles, like Liskin Enterprise and NeighborWorks. And then you have these larger institutions that are trying to, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, back in the day, where they were buying up a lot of the, providing capital for this system. So you see how that's how that network developed. Now, I started this project thinking I was going to try to write a critique of this. I thought, the first title of my book was Nowhere to March. I felt like here was this system. It was impossibly complex, and if you really wanted to complain about it, where would you go, right? I mean, you used to you'd march on Washington. Well, it's really a state program administered by a CDC that has a bank collaboration. I mean, it's not really clear where you'd even demonstrate if you were angry about affordable housing policy at some point. But I became a fan of the approach over time. But I want to go through some weaknesses and then some strengths, I think, of the program. So one weakness is it's incomplete. And I think one way to just even visualize this is in this network example, there are a lot of communities in this country that are not represented in this regime. I think the best treatment of this is the concentrated poverty report that we worked with Alan Berube on, that shows we did 16 case study communities across the country. 15 of them are unrepresented in this system. We had some of our researchers go out to those communities and talk to bankers and say, why aren't you doing more low-income housing tax credit projects? And they say, what is the low-income housing tax credit? Right? And so there are areas that are unrepresented, and that's a real problem. The other is that there's just a need for more resources. I mean, HUD takes a measure of what they call worst case needs. People who are paying too much for their housing, or maybe have something like there's overcrowding, perhaps. And that number hasn't really changed in the last 20 years. So as impressive as this system is, it's still only a holding action to getting people into decent, safe, affordable housing. Now, you saw that I made it seem like it was elegant with all, or maybe I didn't, I don't know. There was that one network slide where all those pieces are moving. One of the things we do at the Federal Reserve quite a bit of is trying to get the bankers to talk to the foundation people who talk to the CDC. Those people don't talk to each other as much as they should. And so there's real benefits to be had by getting the system to run more efficiently. But even more important, I think, is the need to sort of start branching out into other policy areas. So you have a situation where, we know that low-income communities don't just need affordable housing. They need access to jobs and good schools and a number of other sort of services and resources that aren't provided in our network. And these links aren't being made today, and they need to be. Now, the strengths are some that I've already talked about. So the central one is that it combines local knowledge with national and international resources and best practices. I think that's really it's a powerful set of institutions that reach into communities all over the country. It's a real national treasure, and I hope that it manages to survive the economic crisis because it took a long time to build it, and we hope we don't have a lot of those organizations go out of business. It's flexible and adaptable, so you use the same tools. You can use the tax credits, but let's say you're in one area where you have a lot of farming families and you need bigger apartments. You want 5-bedroom apartments. Well, you can still use the same low-income housing tax credit to do that. Or you might need efficiency units for people who are formerly homeless in an inner city location. Again, you can still use the same tools, and you can do, and it's very flexible in that regard. It also has this really interesting sort of self-regulating aspect to it, so that I think of it as sort of the for-profits keep the nonprofits efficient, and the nonprofits keep the for-profits honest. Nonprofits will come in and say, look, I'll do that deal in that tough neighborhood, and the for-profits step up and say, okay, I want those tax credits because I think I can make some money on this deal. I'll step up and work in that neighborhood as well. Meanwhile, of course, there's no excuses for nonprofits to say, well, I'm building at $10 per square foot when this other for-profit's building at $2 per square foot, right? You have to sort of match these sort of indexes together, and that I think is a very effective sort of self-regulating system. The politics of this is interesting, and I think you'd have to be a political junkie to get through the book and get through all the stories here. But honestly, this is stuff that would make a defense contractor blush. When you try to cut CDBG or you want to try to cut the low-income housing tax credit, the coalition that locks into place is effective. And it's wild. It's like Wall Street bankers and nuns and, and then the knives come out. I mean, it's just remarkable. I mean, it's actually kind of, I think, some compelling reading at a good price. And I think I think this is really important. It's an example for other policy areas. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. So I'm going to skip through. I'm going to do three. These are 3 examples from the book. I have several case studies in the book, but I just want to give you a flavor for it. And in all 3 cases, the main funding for all 3 of these is the low-income housing tax credit is the first, home investment partnership block grant second, and CDBG third. This is an interesting project. It's built in Chinatown in Oakland. The need here was pretty obvious early on to some city officials because they said, Chinatown is really struggling with these strip malls in the suburbs. There's no parking here. And so the parking authority partnered with a local nonprofit and said, look, we'll give you the land. We just need 400 spaces of parking. So they did. So the East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation partnered with Bridge Housing to build this project. It's got like 14 layers of financing. I mean, I write about it at length in the book, but it has a first mortgage that's sized to what the tenants can pay in their rent. But it's a beautiful building. This picture was taken 20 years ago, and it looks exactly like that today. It's well managed, well maintained, and it's an anchor for that part of the city. This is another particularly interesting project. It's the Plaza Apartments. It's in San Francisco. San Francisco has a program where they're trying to get people who are formerly homeless, particularly those who have a lot of health problems, into supportive housing with some health services. San Francisco is in an interesting situation. It's a city and a county, and it runs a county hospital. And what was happening was it's a pretty serious homeless population there, and the cost to the emergency room at the hospital was astronomical. What they did was use tax credits to sort of help build this project, in addition to other city subsidies. And now this is a place that homes formerly homeless people. There's several buildings like this in the city. It's been a tremendous savings to the city in terms of saved medical costs that they are able to feed back into their housing resources. Again, for flexibility, I really want to sort of hark back to that aspect of this system. This is another interesting project. This is in Poway, is the city. It's outside of San Diego. Not only is it beautiful, I mean, not only would you be proud to live there, and one of the quotes I have in the book was this woman saying, I order a pizza and they're not afraid to deliver it to me here. It's sort of there's a pride of ownership. There's pride of living in a decent place that's palpable. One thing that's really cool about this one though is that it's got all the roofs are solar panels. This project is a net exporter of electricity back to the electrical grid. No low-income person that lives in this project pays an electrical bill, and it's an interesting example of sort of green policy sort of dovetailing with some social policy as well. Now, before I mentioned this, I thought it was important that there was that this was a policy example for other policy areas. I think the most explicit example of that is with the new markets tax credit. The new markets tax credit was modeled on the low-income housing tax credit, although it's not as deep of a subsidy as the low-income housing tax credit. And it's designed to get what they call near bankable deals into the bankable category. So just kind of give you that little bit of a shift so that you could start a small business in a place that, within a low-income community where you may not have been able to get that loan as a straight market deal. This is a project built primarily with the proceeds from new markets tax credit. It's called Market Creek Plaza. It's in San Diego. I think this one's particularly interesting. To hear the woman who sort of the driving force behind this is a moving experience, because she's about this tall, this little old lady, and this used to be an intersection that was heavily contested with a number of rival gangs. I don't know what it was called. It was called like Bloody Corner or Hamburger Hill or something like that. I mean, the police didn't go here. She marched right up in the middle of it and started looking for people. Like, are you in a gang? And he's like, yeah, I'm in a gang. So I want to talk to your boss. She talks to the leaders of all the gangs that are contested in space here and said, look, I want this to be neutral territory. What do I have to give you to get that? And they said, we want jobs for our members. She said, I'm going to give you that. So the gang members were part of the planning process here. In addition to the wider community. Now, a lot of people who live in this community are from southern Mexico, have a kind of a nostalgia for Mayan architecture. So you can see that was incorporated in. That's something that they wanted in this development. You also see there's an amphitheater here. The community wanted someplace where they could gather as a community. But this is a network that's very similar to the network that I described in the housing example. So the new markets tax credit is the driver that creates the quasi market. But there are also community development financial institutions, CDFIs, that play a role very similar to the CDCs, and a number of other intermediary institutions that help these transactions work. Again, another network in sort of a small business area. And this network is not nearly as developed as the others, but it's getting there, and it's showing some interesting promise, and that's with charter schools. And I finally have a East Coast example. Sorry, but I didn't even notice they're all California examples, but I'm not trying to be state-centric here. Here's a KIPP Knowledge is Power program facility here, and I think it's Southeast DC. John, you probably did the loan on this. This is a project where so if you start a charter school, you have access to the per pupil ADA funding for that pupil, but there's no money for facilities, and so it's very hard for charter schools to get over that hump and get into a building. One of the programs that's particularly interesting is the Department of Education has a credit enhancement for facilities bonds, so it's unlocking a tremendous amount of market capital to build projects like this. And what you're starting to see as the money starts flowing through that system, nonprofits that just specialize in building these facilities, nonprofits that specialize just in the management of them, these other intermediary organizations, these other nodes in a new network for charter schools that are helping getting these projects done. And so what happens is, if you are a great teacher who understands your community and have a kind of a pedagogical plan in mind, you don't also have to know how to interact with the city about your water bill or to figure out what my mortgage is going to be, right? You can really focus on the things that you do best, and that's what's so amazing about a network system. So one of the things I think is sort of, I don't mean to be particularly gimmicky with that whole pre-modern, post, all that stuff. I don't mean to be really gimmicky about that, but I sometimes I think about maybe we are on the verge of an epic shift. That we really are on the verge of a new era in what I often call the postmodern welfare state. And one of the things I think is really cool about that is this one quote I end the book with, and it's basically this community development corporation executive directors, and he's in the Mississippi Delta, and he's talking about this interaction he has with this woman who's a tenant in one of his buildings, and she's sharing with him all the sort of concerns she has about her community. And he's saying how great that is. He says, because he's getting so much market intelligence, he's understanding what the problems are. He says, the last line is, yeah, we cover a lot of ground in the grocery store. And I thought, how awesome is that? You sort of at that moment can meet that woman with her concerns with the sort of the tools of global capital, national subsidy, and the universe of problem-solving ideas right there in that moment. And I think the real challenge, and I think this is what the part we really need to sort of evolve into, is that we need to build out the affordable housing community development network. I think we're close to that. I think there's some weaknesses to it. There's better coordination and reaching into new areas, but I think we're close. We need a health network and an education network and a public safety network and a green network. And when we can sort of walk into a community shoulder to shoulder with all those different networks and say, look, here's a comprehensive set of tools to the people who live there to help them solve the problems that they're experiencing, then I think we're really on the verge of really making sure that every neighborhood in this country is one that is a neighborhood of choice, opportunity, and hope. And that's the story of the book. Thank you.